Hello, my name is Jay, and welcome to my channel where I talk about films that I believe need to be talked about more, like today's film, which is 1989's Darkroom. Now, the interesting thing about Darkroom is, number one, I've never heard of it my whole life. I've been into horror films since 2013 when I was 11 years old and in the 5th grade. And I first got into like your well-known tiers like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you name it. But then eventually when I got a bit older, and I was, like 13, 14, I got into some like more like, underrated ones that are like, might end up on underrated lists, but are still fairly well known throughout people in the horror community. Shit like Sleepaway Camp, My Bloody Valentine, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, The Prowler, etc. But then, like throughout the years, as I was getting older, and I would be like, 16, I got, into this like really deep into like the horror iceberg, particularly the 80s horror iceberg, and I found out that there's a whole new tier of not just underrated horror films, but like really underrated horror films. Like horror films so underrated, if they didn't happen to like show up on like streaming things like Shudder or Tubi, I would have never have gotten to see them. And personally, I like films like that because, of course, they didn't make enough money, they didn't get popular, most of them didn't even get sequels, but they are unique in their own ways. Like, they feature more, like interesting, motivated killers, like killers that have a motivation for their killings that are more interesting, as well as like freakier and creepier looking mask compared to like Michael's white mask with brown hair compared to like Jason Voorhees' hockey mask. Yeah, it's bizarre. And so now Darkroom, it's like a giallo kind of horror film. Like, not necessarily giallo because it's not, Mediterranean, but it kind of like gives off the vibe that it was inspired by giallo, films like Blood and Black Lace and Naked You Die, and so it's about this boy, like, let's say 11 or 12. He hears some noises coming from his parents' room at night. They're like laughing, kind of like funny laughing, like kind of like like they're sexually having a good time. And he explores it, goes to see what's up, and to freaking find that his freaking dad and his mom are wearing nothing but underwear, and his dad has had his mom tied up in a sexual bondage position to take lustful porn photos of her, pretty much, yeah. And, with him being, just a preteen, it, messes with him, of course, wouldn't it not? And so, what would any, typical, tween boy who finds his parents doing really stuff that he shouldn't see, does he? Well, what can he do? He just freaking goes, gets some gasoline from the garage, pours it all over his kitchen floor, and sets the house on fire, wakes up his younger brother, and then they escape, and the house burns down with his parents inside, and they die. And it gets completely laid off as an accident, just an accidental fire, with no suspicion of, the boy having started it, and he gets away with murder of his own parents. Like, it wasn't, kind of like up close and personal, like strangulation, stabbing, or bludgeoning, like blunt force, like a hammer or a baseball bat. He just, set the house on fire and got out with his brother and left his parents in it to die. So it was more of like, shooting / poisoning, not really up close and personal. But, that's kind of how it will go. And then years go on, the boys now and his brother have they've been adopted by their cousins and living on, and this boy, now a man, let's say like maybe late teens, early 20s, probably 20, just the age, 22, college age. He, sees, what else happens. Some people near in his neighborhood doing the same stuff, the sexual porch, and it, brings back the trauma, the PTSD, but this time he gets an axe and just hacks them, and then gets the camera that the guy had, and then he photographs the bodies of the dead bodies, and then it becomes an addiction for him. He now likes to hack people with an axe and photograph their bodies and like keep the picture of the body, is like a trophy. Like he just, he hacks people with an axe, has a film camera, takes the photo of their corpse, and then just takes the photo home with him, and takes it home to his dark room and develops it, and which is why the film is called Darkroom. And, and then, it's the thing is about Darkroom is that it's like, it's just psychological, like we're the villain is the main character and we are rooting for the villain. It's not like your typical horror film. Like horror films, the good people are the bad guys, and then you have we follow the characters, like random people who get, hunted down by, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers, like Laurie Strode and Sidney Prescott from Scream, Ghostface. But in Darkroom, this horror film, we are playing the bad guy. We're the killer. We're on the killer's side. We're supposed to feel sorry for him that he has trauma, but also root for him that he gets away with his crimes. And it's so interesting, and of course, yes, there's people that are, good and try and fight him off and eventually kill him in self-defense. And, it ends with, the police showing up and then taking a photograph of his dead body. And then we get to see his photo, and it's like, pure karma because, he liked to take photos of people after killing them. And now he was getting his photo taken as him dead. But the thing is, they made him, the person that we play, like we're in his world, like he's, the bad guy, the killer, but he's the main character. It's, they don't really these films are really a rare treasure, and it's and it really crosses my mind of how they didn't get that big and how no one knows of Darkroom except for me, because, I'm a horror fan, deep in the horror iceberg. But, and the whole reason why I wanted to make this video is to just share this film out, for anyone who's, into horror and of course hasn't heard of Darkroom because of how freaking underrated it is. Like I said, I'm Jay, where I talk about films that need to be talked about more. And so personally, out of 5 stars, I give Darkroom 5. Yeah, some people, thought that it was, corny 80s acting and all that, but I liked it. I love Darkroom. And the thing is, a lot of people will say, hey, what is Darkroom? Because, Darkroom is probably one of the most underrated films in history, with no one knowing about it and all that, it being a forgotten film. But it really just gives off the vibe about how, creativity can just be delivered, and this was of course, Jeffrey Dahmer was known to photograph his victims' bodies, but this was before Jeffrey Dahmer was caught, because Jeffrey Dahmer didn't get caught until 1991, and this film came out in 1989. Okay, yeah, it's almost like Darkroom kind of predicted the future in a way with, the Dahmer case, but only Darkroom's, fictional, and this, camera-wielding killer is just, a character. He's not, actually, he's a fictional serial killer, not a real serial killer, but, the thing is, it's very interesting to know about how films can just get made and just forgotten about in the blink of time. And it's no one even knows that this film exists. It's except for me, because I'm, a geek. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Darkroom, great horror film, great, but underrated. And a lot of people might look down on it because, they never heard it, thinking that, because it was never got popular, that it's probably not good. It's probably cheesy, sleazy, you name it, not a good, not, cringy acting. But it's good. And why did it get underrated? Beats me. And all I gotta say is, watch Darkroom.